The cold waters of the Missouri River roared beneath Katherine Osborne's trembling feet as she stood on the edge of Dawson Bridge, her tear-stained face illuminated only by the silver light of a full moon. Montana Territory, 1875, a place where most came seeking fortune, but where Katherine had found only heartbreak and despair. Her fingers clutched the worn letter that had shattered her world just hours before, the paper now damp with tears and the evening mist that hung over the water. Drew Falconer spotted her from a distance, the silhouette of a woman against the moonlight catching his eye as he rode back toward Helena after a long cattle drive. Something about her stance, the way she leaned forward, her body poised like a bird about to take flight, sent alarm racing through his veins. Without hesitation, he urged his horse forward, closing the distance between them with each thundering hoofbeat. "Don't do it, miss." Drew called out, his voice carrying over the sound of rushing water as he dismounted, boots hitting the wooden planks of the bridge with a heavy thud. He approached slowly, hands outstretched as if gentling a spooked mare. "Whatever troubles you're facing, jumping ain't the answer." Katherine turned, startled by the deep voice breaking through her thoughts. She hadn't expected anyone to be crossing the bridge at this late hour. "Stay back," she warned, her voice quavering with emotion. "This doesn't concern you, sir." Drew took another cautious step forward, keeping his movements deliberate and calm. The moonlight revealed her fully now, a young woman perhaps 20 years of age, with auburn hair falling loose from what had once been an elegant arrangement. Her clothing suggested means, but her expression spoke of absolute desolation. "My name's Drew Falconer," he said gently, removing his hat in a gesture of respect. "And I reckon it does concern me when I see a fellow soul in such pain. What's your name, miss?" "Katherine," she replied after a moment's hesitation. "Katherine Osborne, though it hardly matters now." Drew noticed her knuckles whitening as she gripped the bridge railing. "It matters to me, Miss Osborne, and I suspect it matters to someone else too." A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "You're wrong about that, Mr. Falconer. I've just learned that the last person who might have cared is gone." She glanced down at the crumpled letter in her hand. "My father's dead. Consumption took him 3 weeks ago in Boston. The letter just arrived today." Drew inched closer, now only a few feet away. He could see the streaks of tears on her face, the rawness of grief etched in every feature. "I'm mighty sorry for your loss, Miss Osborne. Truly I am, but your father wouldn't want you to follow him this way." "You didn't know my father," she said sharply, then softened, her shoulders sagging under the weight of her sorrow. "He was all I had left. After my mother and brother died of fever last year, he sent me west to stay with my aunt in Helena while he settled his affairs. She passed just a month after I arrived. I've been alone, waiting for him to come as he promised. Now he never will." The cowboy was close enough now that he could have reached out and touched her arm, but he kept his distance, sensing that any sudden movement might push her over the edge literally. "So you've known grief, terrible grief. I understand that road better than most." Something in his tone caught Katherine's attention. She looked at him, really looked for the first time, taking in the weathered face that seemed too lined for a man who couldn't be much past 30, the compassionate eyes that held shadows of their own. "How could you possibly understand?" Drew leaned against the railing, deliberately turning to look out at the water rather than at her, giving her space. "Lost my wife and baby daughter to childbed fever 5 years back. For months after, I looked down from high places and wondered if the fall would hurt, or if it would be quick." He spoke matter-of-factly, without self-pity. Katherine's grip on the railing loosened slightly. "What stopped you?" "Wasn't any one thing," Drew admitted. "Some days it was just being too stubborn to give up. Other times, it was small moments, a sunrise so beautiful it made my chest ache, or the way my horse would nuzzle my pocket looking for sugar cubes." He paused, glancing sideways at her. "Life has a way of offering reasons to stay if you're willing to notice them." Katherine's eyes welled with fresh tears. "I have nothing left, no family, barely any money, no prospects. I came west because my father believed there was opportunity here, but all I've found is loneliness." Drew turned to face her fully now. "Montana Territory can be harsh, no denying that. But it can also offer a fresh start. You've survived losses that would break most people, Miss Osborne. That kind of strength is rare. Strength, she echoed disbelievingly. Look at me, I'm standing on a bridge ready to end my life. That's not strength. You're still here, ain't you? Talking to a stranger instead of jumping. Seems to me like some part of you is fighting to stay alive. Drew cautiously extended his hand. Come away from the edge. Dawn's only a few hours off, and things have a way of looking different in the light of day. Katherine stared at his outstretched hand, conflicted. The rushing waters below still called to her with their promise of an end to pain, but this cowboy's unexpected kindness had created a tiny crack in her resolve. I don't know where to go, she whispered. First step is just coming away from the edge, Drew said gently. After that, we can figure out the rest together. A long moment passed, the only sounds the river below and the occasional night bird calling. Then, with trembling fingers, Katherine reached out and placed her hand in Drew's. His palm was rough with calluses but warm and steady as he carefully helped her step back from the precipice. As soon as she was safely away from the edge, her legs gave way beneath her. Drew caught her before she could collapse, supporting her weight easily as she began to sob deep, racking cries that seemed torn from the depths of her soul. That's it, he murmured, awkwardly patting her shoulder. Let it out. There's no shame in grieving. They stayed that way for several minutes. A strange tableau on the moonlit bridge, the cowboy standing rigid but supportive, the woman clinging to him as she released months of bottled sorrow. When her crying finally subsided into hiccuping breaths, Drew spoke again. My camp's not far. I can make you some coffee and you can warm yourself by the fire. Come morning, I'll see you safely to town. Katherine pulled away slightly, embarrassed by her breakdown. Why are you helping me? You don't even know me. Drew considered this, then shrugged. Someone once did the same for me when I was at my lowest. Besides, he added with the ghost of a smile, my mother raised me to believe a gentleman doesn't leave a lady in distress, especially not at midnight on a bridge. Despite herself, Katherine felt a hint of a smile tugging at her lips. Is your camp far? I'm afraid I'm quite exhausted. Just beyond that stand of cottonwoods, Drew replied, gesturing toward the riverbank. My horse bandit can carry us both that far. He whistled sharply, and a large black gelding trotted obediently toward them. Katherine hesitated, years of proper Boston upbringing warring with her current circumstances. It wouldn't be proper, begging your pardon, Miss Osborne, but I reckon we're well past concerning ourselves with what's proper, Drew interrupted gently. You need rest and warmth, not social niceties. Recognizing the truth in his words, Katherine allowed him to help her mount the horse. Drew swung up behind her, keeping a respectful distance while still ensuring she wouldn't fall. As they rode toward his camp, Katherine clutched her father's letter to her chest, wondering how her life had taken such an unexpected turn in the span of a single evening. Drew's camp was simple but well organized. A small fire burned in a stone-lined pit, a coffee pot sitting ready at its edge, and a bedroll laid out nearby. A second horse, a dun mare, was picketed in the tall grass, raising her head curiously as they approached. It's not much, Drew said as he helped Katherine dismount, but the fire's warm and I've got coffee and some jerky if you're hungry. Katherine sank down on the blanket he offered, suddenly aware of how cold and tired she truly was. Thank you, she said softly, watching as he busied himself with stoking the fire and preparing the coffee. Been on a cattle drive for the Montgomery outfit, Drew explained as he worked. Just heading back to Helena now that it's done. You say you've been living there. Katherine nodded, warming her hands by the fire. In a small room I rent from Mrs. Jenkins on Breckenridge Street. I've been working at the Mercantile, but… She trailed off, looking down at her hands. But it's not what you pictured when you came west, Drew finished for her. No, she admitted. Father was supposed to join me. We had plans to start a new life together. He was going to open a bookshop. A fresh wave of grief washed over her at the thought of those dreams, now forever unrealized. Drew handed her a tin cup of strong, black coffee. Dreams have a way of changing, but that doesn't mean you can't form new ones. Katherine accepted the cup, letting the warmth seep into her fingers. I'm not sure I have the strength for new dreams. You will, Drew said with quiet conviction. Not today, maybe not tomorrow, but you will. They sat in companionable silence as the fire crackled and the stars wheeled overhead. Katherine found herself studying her unlikely savior when he wasn't looking the way the firelight caught in his dark hair, the straight line of his nose, the way his hands moved with certainty and purpose. There was something comforting about his presence, a steadiness that made her feel safer than she had in months. "You should try to get some sleep," Drew said eventually. "Take my bedroll, I'll keep watch." Katherine wanted to protest, but exhaustion was already pulling at her. "What about you?" "I've slept under the stars plenty of times with nothing but my saddle for a pillow," he assured her. "Go on now." Too tired to argue further, Katherine curled up in his bedroll, surprised by how quickly sleep claimed her. Her last conscious thought was that this strange cowboy had saved her life twice tonight, once by stopping her from jumping, and again by giving her a reason, however small, to see the dawn. Drew watched her sleeping form in the dying firelight, wondering what twist of fate had put him on that bridge at precisely the right moment. He'd seen that look before in his own eyes in the mirror after Sarah and the baby died. That hollow emptiness that made the thought of oblivion seem like a blessing. He'd meant what he said about someone helping him. An old crow medicine man named Two Bears had found him drunk and half frozen in a snowbank, dragged him back to life, and spent weeks telling him stories and making him see that his pain, while deep, was part of being human. Drew had never been able to repay that debt directly, but perhaps helping this young woman was a way of honoring what Two Bears had done for him. As the first hints of dawn lightened the eastern sky, Drew made a silent promise to the sleeping woman. He couldn't fix her grief or bring back what she'd lost, but he would make sure she understood that her life still had value, that she was worth more than a desperate leap into cold, unforgiving waters. Katherine woke to the smell of coffee and bacon, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. The events of the previous night came rushing back as she sat up, finding Drew crouched by a freshly built morning fire, cooking breakfast. "Good morning," he said, glancing up with a small smile. "Figured you could use some real food." Katherine ran a hand through her tangled hair, acutely aware of her disheveled appearance. "Good morning. I hope I haven't been too much trouble." Drew shook his head, sliding a portion of bacon onto a tin plate. "No trouble. How are you feeling today?" It was a simple question, but Katherine had to think about it. The crushing despair of the previous night had receded somewhat, leaving a dull ache rather than the sharp, unbearable pain that had driven her to the bridge. "I'm still here," she said finally. "I suppose that's something." "It's everything," Drew corrected gently, handing her the plate. "Eat up." "Town's about an hour's ride from here." As they ate, Katherine found herself studying the man across the fire. In the daylight, she could see him more clearly, the lean strength of his frame, the way his dark hair curled slightly at his collar, the fine lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested he smiled more often than his serious demeanor indicated. "Mr. Falconer," she began hesitantly. "Drew," he corrected. "After sharing a campfire, I reckon we can use first names." Katherine nodded. "Drew, then, I wanted to thank you properly. For last night, I wasn't thinking clearly." "Grief has a way of clouding judgment," he said simply. "No need for thanks." "Nevertheless, you have my gratitude." She paused, then added softly, "and my embarrassment. I'm not usually so human," Drew suggested with a quirk of his eyebrow. "There's no shame in breaking under the weight of loss, Katherine. The shame would be in not allowing yourself to feel it." His words struck her deeply. All her life, she'd been taught that proper ladies maintained composure at all costs. Even after her mother and brother's deaths, her father had encouraged stoicism rather than emotional displays. She'd held herself together for so long that when the final blow came, she'd shattered completely. "Will you tell me about your wife?" she asked suddenly, surprising herself with the question. Drew's hands stilled for a moment before continuing to pack up their breakfast things. "Sarah," he said after a pause. "Her name was Sarah. She loved wildflowers and could sing like an angel, laughed at all my bad jokes." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "We were married just shy of 2 years when she died. Our daughter lived long enough for me to hold her once." Katherine's heart ached for him. "I'm sorry, truly." It was a long time ago, Drew said, though his eyes told a different story. The pain changes shape over time, becomes something you carry rather than something that drags you under. They finished breaking camp in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. When it came time to ride, Drew helped Katherine onto his horse before mounting behind her. The journey to Helena passed quickly, with Drew occasionally pointing out landmarks or sharing brief anecdotes about the territory. Katherine found herself leaning back against him, drawing comfort from his solid presence. As they approached the outskirts of town, Katherine felt a growing anxiety. "I'm not sure I can face going back to my room," she admitted. "Everything there reminds me of waiting for Father." Drew was quiet for a moment, considering. "I know a place you might stay for a while. Mrs. Sullivan runs a respectable boarding house for working women. She's a fair-minded widow with a soft spot for those down on their luck." Katherine bristled slightly. "I don't need charity." "It's not charity," Drew corrected firmly. "It's neighbors helping neighbors. That's how folks survive out here." By the time they reached Helena, the streets were bustling with morning activity. Katherine became acutely aware of her rumpled appearance, and the curious glances thrown their way. A disheveled young woman riding double with a dusty cowboy was bound to raise eyebrows. Drew seemed oblivious to the attention as he guided his horse to a modest two-story house on a side street. A sign reading "Sullivan Boarding House" hung over the porch, freshly painted and welcoming. "Wait here," Drew said, helping Katherine dismount before approaching the door. Katherine watched as he spoke with a plump, silver-haired woman who appeared at the entrance. There was some discussion, with occasional glances in her direction, before Drew motioned for her to join them. "Katherine Osborne, this is Mrs. Margaret Sullivan," Drew introduced. "Mrs. Sullivan, Miss Osborne is new to our territory and finding her footing." The older woman's shrewd eyes took in Katherine's appearance, but her expression remained kind. "Any friend of Drew Falconer's is welcome here, Miss Osborne. I happen to have a room available if you're interested." Katherine glanced uncertainly at Drew, who gave her an encouraging nod. "Thank you, Mrs. Sullivan. I would be grateful for the accommodation." "Wonderful," Mrs. Sullivan said briskly. "Drew, you're welcome to use the washroom out back before you head on your way. Miss Osborne, come with me and I'll show you to your room." Before following Mrs. Sullivan inside, Katherine turned to Drew. "Will I see you again?" she asked, surprised by how much she wanted the answer to be yes. Drew settled his hat more firmly on his head. "I've got some business to attend to in town. I'll check on you in a day or two, if that's all right." Katherine nodded, feeling strangely reluctant to part from this man who was still virtually a stranger yet had become her lifeline. "Thank you, Drew, for everything." "Just remember what I said," he replied quietly. "Each day brings new reasons to stay." With those words, he tipped his hat and led his horse toward the livery, leaving Katherine to follow Mrs. Sullivan into what would become her new temporary home. The next few days passed in a blur for Katherine. Mrs. Sullivan proved to be a practical but compassionate landlady, giving Katherine space to grieve while gently encouraging her to maintain daily routines. The boarding house was home to 3 other women, a schoolteacher, a seamstress, and a young widow who worked as a telegraph operator, all of whom welcomed Katherine with varying degrees of warmth. True to his word, Drew appeared on the 3rd day, freshly shaved and wearing a clean shirt, his usual dusty trail clothes exchanged for more respectable town attire. Katherine was surprised by how her heart lifted at the sight of him standing on the porch, hat in hand. "Miss Osborne," he greeted her formally, aware of Mrs. Sullivan hovering nearby. "I was wondering if you might like to take a walk around town. The weather's fine today." Katherine accepted eagerly, grateful for the excuse to escape the well-meaning but sometimes stifling atmosphere of the boarding house. As they strolled down Helena's main street, Drew pointed out various establishments and shared bits of local history. "That's Simmons Mercantile," he said, gesturing to a large storefront. "Old man Simmons is fair with his prices, which is more than can be said for some." Katherine paused, looking at the store thoughtfully. "I worked at Barton's Mercantile before everything happened. I should probably speak with Mr. Barton about returning." Drew studied her face carefully. Is that what you want to do? The question caught Catherine off guard. No one had asked what she wanted in a very long time. I need to support myself, she said practically. That's not what I asked, Drew pointed out gently. Catherine was quiet for a moment as they continued walking. I don't know what I want, she admitted finally. When I came west, I had dreams of helping Father with his bookshop. I've always loved books, reading them, discussing them, even just the smell of them. A small, sad smile crossed her face. Father used to say I knew more about literature than most university professors. Drew considered this. There's no bookshop in Helena that I know of. Nearest one's probably in Virginia City. It doesn't matter now, Catherine said, shaking off the momentary wistfulness. Dreams change, as you said. They continued their walk, gradually making their way to a small park where several benches overlooked a creek that ran through town. As they sat, Drew surprised her by pulling a small package from his jacket pocket. Got something for you, he said, seeming almost shy as he handed it to her. Catherine unwrapped the brown paper to find a slim volume of poetry Wordsworth's collected works. The book was clearly second-hand but had been well cared for. Drew, she breathed, running her fingers over the embossed cover. This is lovely, but you shouldn't have found it at the general store, he said, cutting off her protest. Thought you might like something to read besides Mrs. Sullivan's Bible and Almanac. I love Wordsworth, Catherine said, genuinely touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift. How did you know? Drew shrugged, a hint of color touching his tan cheeks. Lucky guess. Figured a woman who wanted to run a bookshop might appreciate words that paint pictures. Catherine opened the book carefully, turning to one of her favorite poems, I wandered lonely as a cloud. The familiar lines brought a lump to her throat, reminding her of afternoons spent reading in her father's study in Boston. Would you read some? Drew asked hesitantly. Out loud, I mean. Been a while since I heard good poetry. Catherine looked at him in surprise. Most men of her acquaintance in Boston had little interest in poetry, considering it primarily a feminine pursuit. You enjoy poetry? Drew looked slightly embarrassed. Don't get much chance to read it these days, but my mother was a schoolteacher before she married Pa. She taught me to appreciate fine words. Touched by this glimpse into his past, Catherine began to read, her voice gaining strength and expression as she continued. When she finished, she looked up to find Drew watching her with an intensity that made her cheeks warm. You read beautifully, he said simply. Makes the words come alive. Thank you, Catherine replied, closing the book carefully. And thank you for the gift, it means more than you know. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the creek flow past. Catherine found herself stealing glances at Drew's profile, noticing the strong line of his jaw, the thoughtful set of his mouth. Tell me more about yourself, she said finally. What do you do when you're not rescuing women from bridges? A flicker of amusement crossed Drew's face. Mostly I work cattle, hired hand for different ranches depending on the season. I've got a small claim about 10 miles outside town, just a cabin and enough land for a few horses. Nothing fancy. Do you like it, that life? Catherine asked, genuinely curious. Drew considered the question seriously. Most days, it's honest work and I like being under the open sky. Gets lonely sometimes, he admitted, but I've got good neighbors when I need company. No family nearby, Drew shook his head. Pa died when I was 16. Ma followed a few years later. Got a brother somewhere in California, but we haven't exchanged letters in a while. Catherine nodded, understanding the ache of family lost or distant. I'm beginning to think being alone might be the natural state of things out here. It doesn't have to be, Drew said quietly. Folks out here make their own families sometimes not by blood, but by choice and circumstance. Their conversation was interrupted by the town clock striking 4. Drew stood reluctantly. I should get you back before Mrs. Sullivan sends out a search party. She's protective of her boarders. As they walked back toward the boarding house, Drew cleared his throat. There's a social at the church this Saturday. Nothing fancy, just music, dancing, some food. Would you consider attending? With me, I mean, Catherine hesitated. The thought of a social gathering seemed overwhelming after everything that had happened, yet she found herself reluctant to refuse Drew's invitation. I'm not sure I'd be very good company, she said honestly. You don't have to be, Drew assured her. We could just go for a little while. Might do you good to meet some more townspeople. Looking at his hopeful expression, Katherine found herself nodding. All right, but promise we can leave if I find it too difficult. You have my word, Drew said solemnly, though his eyes crinkled with pleasure at her acceptance. At the boarding house steps, Katherine paused. Thank you for the book, Drew, and for the invitation. My pleasure, Katherine, he replied, tipping his hat before turning to leave. I'll call for you at 6 on Saturday. Katherine watched him walk away, clutching the book of poetry to her chest and marveling at how, in less than a week, this man had begun to transform her desolation into something that, if not quite hope, was at least no longer complete despair. The days leading up to the social passed more quickly than Katherine expected. Mrs. Sullivan, upon hearing about the invitation, insisted on helping Katherine refresh one of her dresses, a simple blue cotton that had been packed away since her arrival in Helena. A bit of lace at the collar will brighten it right up, the older woman declared, already rummaging through her sewing basket. And we must do something with your hair, dear. Such a lovely color, but it needs a proper styling. Katherine submitted to these ministrations with a mixture of gratitude and amusement. It had been months since she'd taken any real interest in her appearance, and Mrs. Sullivan's enthusiastic fussing was oddly comforting, reminiscent of her mother's loving attention before formal events in Boston. By Saturday evening, Katherine hardly recognized the woman in Mrs. Sullivan's small mirror. The blue dress, freshly pressed and adorned with delicate lace, complemented her auburn hair, which had been arranged in a becoming style with soft curls framing her face. Her complexion, pale from months of grief and seclusion, had gained some color from her recent walks with Drew. You look lovely, Miss Osborne, Mrs. Sullivan said approvingly. Drew Falconer won't know what hit him. Katherine blushed, uncomfortable with the implication. We're just friends, Mrs. Sullivan. He's been kind to me during a difficult time, nothing more. The older woman's eyes twinkled knowingly. If you say so, dear, though I've known Drew these 5 years and he's never escorted a lady to a social before, not since his Sarah passed. Before Katherine could respond to this revelation, there was a knock at the door. Mrs. Sullivan hurried to answer it, returning moments later with Drew in tow. Katherine's breath caught at the sight of him. Gone was the dusty cowboy, replaced by a gentleman in a well-tailored dark suit, white shirt, and string tie. His usually windswept hair had been tamed with pomade, and he'd clearly visited the barber for a fresh shave. Only his hat, a good Stetson, but undeniably a cowboy's hat, betrayed his usual occupation. Drew, for his part, had stopped dead in his tracks, staring at Katherine with undisguised admiration. Miss Osborne, he said finally, remembering his manners, you look, that is, blue suits you mighty well. Mrs. Sullivan rolled her eyes at his awkwardness. What Mr. Falconer is trying to say, Miss Osborne, is that you look beautiful. Now off with you both. Have a wonderful evening. The church social was held in the community hall adjacent to Helena's white steepled Methodist church. As Drew and Katherine approached, the sounds of fiddle music and laughter spilled out into the evening air. Katherine hesitated at the entrance, suddenly nervous. Drew seemed to sense her apprehension. We don't have to stay long, he reminded her gently. Just long enough to say hello to a few folks. Katherine nodded, drawing strength from his steady presence beside her. I'm ready. Inside, the hall had been transformed with paper lanterns and wildflower arrangements. A small band played at one end of the room, while tables laden with food lined the other. Between them, couples whirled in a lively square dance. Drew led Katherine to a relatively quiet corner where they could observe the festivities without being immediately overwhelmed. Can I get you some punch? He offered. Yes, thank you, Katherine replied, grateful for a moment to gather herself. While Drew made his way to the refreshment table, Katherine found herself approached by a friendly-looking woman about her own age. You must be Miss Osborne, the woman said warmly. I'm Eliza Kenwood, the schoolteacher at Mrs. Sullivan's boarding house. We haven't properly met yet. I've been visiting my sister in Butt. It's a pleasure to meet you, Miss Kenwood, Katherine replied, relieved by the woman's easy manner. I see Drew Falconer brought you tonight, Eliza continued with a knowing smile. He's a good man. Half the unmarried women in the territory have set their caps for him since his mourning period ended, but he's never shown interest. Until now, it seems. Katherine felt her cheeks warm. We're just friends. He's been kind enough to show me around town, that's all. Eliza looked skeptical but was prevented from commenting further by Drew's return. He handed Katherine a cup of punch, nodding politely to Eliza. Miss Kenwood, he greeted her. I trust your sister in Bud as well. Very well, thank you, Eliza replied. She's expecting her second child in December. As they chatted, Katherine gradually relaxed, finding Eliza's conversation engaging and Drew's solid presence beside her reassuring. When Eliza excused herself to speak with another acquaintance, Drew turned to Katherine. How are you holding up? He asked quietly. Better than I expected, she admitted. Everyone has been very welcoming. Folks out here generally are, Drew said. Life's hard enough without making it harder on each other. The music changed to a slower waltz and Drew hesitated before asking, Would you care to dance, Katherine? Only if you're comfortable, of course. Katherine considered the question. She hadn't danced since before her mother and brother's deaths, and the thought of doing so now brought a pang of guilt. Yet looking up at Drew's hopeful expression, she found herself nodding. I'd like that, though I'm out of practice. Makes two of us, Drew said with a self-deprecating smile as he led her to the dance floor. His hand at her waist was respectful but steady as they began to move to the music. After a few awkward moments, they found their rhythm, turning gracefully among the other couples. You dance well for a cowboy, Katherine remarked, surprised by his skill. Drew chuckled. My mother insisted I learn, said even cowboys should know how to behave in civilized company. As they continued to dance, Katherine became aware of curious glances from others in the room. People are watching us, she murmured uncomfortably. That's because you're the prettiest woman here, Drew replied matter-of-factly, then looked embarrassed by his own boldness. Katherine felt a flutter of something unfamiliar in her chest, not the crushing weight of grief that had been her constant companion for months, but something lighter, almost buoyant. Thank you, she said softly, for bringing me tonight, for everything. Drew's eyes, when they met hers, held warmth and something more complex that she wasn't ready to name. You're welcome, Katherine. The evening continued pleasantly, with Drew introducing Katherine to various townspeople, the mayor and his wife, the local doctor, and several ranchers with whom Drew had worked. By the time they left, Katherine had received 2 invitations to tea and an offer from the doctor's wife to join her reading circle. Walking back to the boarding house under a canopy of stars, Katherine felt more at peace than she had since receiving news of her father's death. I enjoyed myself tonight, she admitted. I hadn't expected to. I'm glad, Drew said sincerely. It does a body good to remember there's still joy to be found, even after sorrow. At the boarding house steps, they paused. Katherine was acutely aware of Drew standing close, his face half illuminated by the porch lamp. Would you like to go riding tomorrow? He asked. I could show you some of the country beyond town limits, if you're interested, that is. I'd like that very much, Katherine replied, surprised by how much she meant it. Though I should warn you, it's been years since I've been on a horse. Don't worry, Drew assured her with a smile. I've got a gentle mare who'll treat you right. I'll come by around noon if that suits. Noon is perfect, Katherine agreed. There was a moment of hesitation, as if both were uncertain how to properly end the evening. Finally, Drew took her hand and raised it briefly to his lips, a gesture at once old-fashioned and oddly affecting. Good night, Katherine. Sleep well. Good night, Drew, she replied softly, watching as he walked away into the darkness before entering the boarding house, her heart lighter than it had been in months. True to his word, Drew arrived the next day at noon, leading 2 horses, his own black gelding and a gentle-looking chestnut mare. Katherine, dressed in a practical riding skirt borrowed from Eliza Kenwood, waited on the porch with a small basket packed by Mrs. Sullivan. Mrs. Sullivan insisted I bring lunch, Katherine explained as Drew helped her mount the mare. She seems to think you don't eat properly when left to your own devices. Drew laughed, adjusting the stirrups for her comfort. She's probably right, ready to see some of Montana's finer views. The day was perfect for riding, warm sunshine tempered by a cool breeze, with vast blue skies stretching endlessly overhead. Drew led them out of town and up into the foothills, where pine forests gave way to meadows brilliant with late summer wildflowers. "It's beautiful," Katherine breathed, taking in the panoramic vista of mountains in the distance and the valley spread below them. "I've never seen anything like it. This is why I stay," Drew said simply. "Even on the hardest days, there's this." They dismounted in a sheltered meadow near a small stream where Drew spread a blanket for their lunch. As they ate Mrs. Sullivan's fried chicken and biscuits, Katherine found herself relaxing completely, laughing at Drew's stories of cattle drive mishaps and sharing her own memories of growing up in Boston. "I never thought I'd end up in Montana territory," she admitted, leaning back on her elbows to watch clouds drift overhead. "Father was originally planning to send me to my aunt in Seattle, but she was traveling in Europe at the time. Helena was the compromise." Drew looked thoughtful. "Do you regret coming west?" Katherine considered the question carefully. "No," she said finally. "Despite everything, I don't think I do. Boston held too many ghosts after Mother and David died. I needed a fresh start, even if it didn't unfold as planned." "And now?" Drew asked quietly. "What do you want now, Katherine?" It was a question she'd been asking herself increasingly over the past week. "I'm not entirely sure," she admitted, "but I think I'd like to stay in Helena at least for now, find meaningful work, perhaps make a real home here." Drew's expression warmed. "I think that sounds like a fine plan." As the afternoon lengthened, they rode further, with Drew pointing out landmarks and sharing stories of the area's history. Katherine, initially nervous on horseback, gradually gained confidence under Drew's patient guidance. "You're a natural," he encouraged as she navigated a small slope. "The mare likes you." "I like her too," Katherine replied, patting the horse's neck affectionately. "What's her name?" "Penny," Drew said with a smile, "for her copper color." They were making their way back toward town when dark clouds began gathering ominously on the horizon. Drew frowned, studying the sky with concern. "We should head back faster," he said. "That storm's moving in quick, and Montana thunderstorms are nothing to trifle with." They urged their horses to a faster pace, but the storm moved more rapidly than anticipated. Soon, fat raindrops began to fall, quickly becoming a deluge. "My cabin's closer than town," Drew called over the rising wind. "We can wait out the worst of it there." Katherine nodded, already soaked to the skin despite the oilskin coat Drew had insisted she wear. They changed direction, riding through increasingly heavy rain until a small log cabin came into view, nestled against a stand of pines for protection from the elements. Drew helped Katherine dismount before quickly leading both horses to a small lean-to stable attached to the cabin. By the time they reached the cabin door, they were both thoroughly drenched despite their hurried efforts. "I apologize for the state of things," Drew said as he ushered her inside, lighting a lamp to reveal a simple but tidy one-room cabin. "Don't often have visitors." Katherine stood dripping on the plank floor, teeth chattering slightly from the sudden chill. Drew immediately set about building a fire in the stone fireplace that dominated one wall of the cabin. "You need to get out of those wet things," he said practically, not looking up from his task. "I'll find you something dry to wear while your clothes dry by the fire." Under different circumstances, Katherine might have been mortified by the impropriety of the situation, but cold and common sense overrode social niceties. She accepted the clean flannel shirt and trousers Drew handed her, along with a worn quilt to wrap herself in for modesty. "You can change behind that screen," Drew said, indicating a simple wooden partition in one corner. "I'll step outside to check on the horses once more, give you privacy." True to his word, Drew left the cabin, giving Katherine time to peel off her sodden clothing and change into his offered garments. The shirt and trousers were comically large on her slender frame, but they were blessedly dry and smelled of soap and pine clean and somehow distinctly Drew. When he returned, she was sitting wrapped in the quilt by the now blazing fire, her wet clothes spread on a chair nearby to dry. Drew had also changed into dry clothing and carried a steaming kettle from the small cast iron stove in the corner. "Coffee's not much, but it'll warm you up," he said, pouring the dark liquid into 2 tin cups before joining her by the fire. Outside, thunder rumbled and rain lashed against the cabin's small windows, but inside was warm and surprisingly cozy. Katherine sipped the strong coffee gratefully, feeling warmth seep back into her chilled bones. "Some adventure this turned out to be," Drew said ruefully. "Your first proper outing in Montana territory, and you end up half drowned." Katherine surprised herself by laughing. "It's certainly memorable, and your cabin is lovely." Drew glanced around the simple space with new eyes, trying to see it as she might the handmade furniture, bookshelves fashioned from wooden crates, the colorful quilt on the narrow bed, a few treasured photographs in simple frames on the mantel. "It's not much," he said modestly, "but it suits me." Katherine rose, keeping the quilt wrapped around her as she examined the photographs curiously. One showed a younger Drew with an attractive woman, presumably Sarah, their faces alight with happiness. Another depicted an older couple, obviously Drew's parents, standing proudly in front of a farmhouse. "Your family?" she asked softly. Drew nodded, joining her at the mantel. "My parents on their 30th wedding anniversary, and that's Sarah on our wedding day." Katherine studied the smiling woman in the photograph. "She was beautiful." "She was," Drew agreed quietly. "Inside and out." There was no jealousy in Katherine's heart as she looked at the image of Drew's deceased wife, only a deep empathy for the loss he had endured. "Thank you for sharing this with me," she said, meeting his eyes. "For sharing all of this." The intensity of his gaze made her breath catch. They stood very close now, the firelight casting dancing shadows across their faces. For a moment, Katherine thought he might kiss her, and was surprised by how much she wanted him to. Instead, Drew stepped back slightly, clearing his throat. "Storm's easing," he observed, glancing toward the window where the rain had indeed lessened in intensity. "We should be able to head back to town soon, once your clothes are dry." Katherine nodded, trying to hide her disappointment. "Of course." The ride back to Helena was made in companionable silence, the landscape freshly washed by the rain and glowing in the late afternoon sunlight. When they reached the boarding house, Drew helped Katherine dismount, his hands lingering slightly at her waist. "Thank you for today," she said sincerely. "Despite the unexpected downpour, I enjoyed myself immensely." Drew smiled, the expression transforming his usually serious features. "As did I. Perhaps we could do it again sometime, without the drenching, preferably." "I'd like that," Katherine replied, surprised by how much she meant it. As she watched him ride away, leading Penny beside his own mount, Katherine realized with sudden clarity that she was beginning to care for Drew Falconer in a way that went beyond gratitude for his kindness. The realization was both thrilling and frightening. She hadn't expected to open her heart to anyone after the losses she'd endured. Yet, there was something about Drew, his quiet strength, his compassion, his own journey through grief that resonated deeply with her. For the first time since standing on Dawson Bridge, Katherine found herself looking toward the future with something that felt remarkably like hope. Over the following weeks, Katherine gradually established a new routine in Helena. With a reference from Drew, she secured a position at the town library, a small but growing collection housed in a back room of the courthouse. The work suited her perfectly, allowing her to share her love of literature while earning enough to support herself modestly. Drew called regularly, sometimes taking her riding or walking, other times simply visiting at the boarding house, where Mrs. Sullivan conveniently found reasons to leave them alone in the parlor. Their friendship deepened with each meeting, conversations flowing easily between them as they discovered shared interests and complementary perspectives. Katherine learned that beneath Drew's quiet exterior lay a thoughtful mind and dry wit. He, in turn, seemed to delight in her passionate opinions about books and her surprising knowledge of subjects ranging from classical mythology to modern politics. "You continue to surprise me, Miss Osborne," he remarked one evening as they discussed a particularly controversial article in Harper's Weekly. "Not many women I know have such decided views on territorial politics." "Father believed women should be educated in all matters," Katherine explained. "He said ignorance was a choice, not a natural state, regardless of one's sex." "He sounds like a wise man," Drew observed. "You must miss him terribly." I do, Catherine admitted, finding that the acknowledgement no longer brought the overwhelming pain it once had. But I'm beginning to understand what you meant about grief changing shape. I can think of him now with love rather than just loss. Drew reached across the small table between them, briefly covering her hand with his. I'm glad, he said simply. As autumn painted the surrounding mountains with brilliant golds and reds, Catherine found herself increasingly integrated into Helena's community. She joined the doctor's wife's reading circle, volunteered at church socials, and even helped organize a small fundraiser for new school books. Through it all, Drew remained a steady presence in her life, though Catherine sensed he was holding something back, maintaining a careful distance even as they grew closer. She understood his hesitation, recognizing in him the same fear that sometimes gripped her, the fear of loving and losing again. The first snow of the season fell in early November, transforming Helena into a pristine wonderland overnight. Catherine awoke to find Drew waiting on the boarding house porch with a horse-drawn sleigh, his face alight with boyish enthusiasm. Thought you might enjoy a proper Montana sleigh ride, he explained, helping her into the vehicle and tucking warm buffalo robes around her. First snow's always the prettiest. They glided through town and out into the surrounding countryside, the sleigh runners making a satisfying swish against the fresh powder. Catherine tilted her face upward, catching snowflakes on her eyelashes and laughing with unrestrained delight. I've never seen snow like this, she admitted. In Boston, it turns gray and slushy almost immediately. One of the benefits of less civilization, Drew said with a smile, though I reckon you still miss city conveniences sometimes. Catherine considered this, less than I would have expected. I find I prefer Helena's simpler pleasures to Boston's pretensions. Here, people care about who you are, not who your family was or how much money you have. Drew guided the sleigh to a scenic overlook where they could see the entire valley spread below them, the town a collection of toy-like buildings in the distance. I have something to ask you, Catherine, he said, his tone suddenly serious. Catherine's heart quickened, though she kept her expression neutral. What is it? Drew seemed to struggle for words, uncharacteristically hesitant. I've been offered a job, he said finally. Foreman position at the Blackstone Ranch up near Great Falls. Good pay, permanent position rather than seasonal work. That sounds like a wonderful opportunity, Catherine said carefully, unsure why he seemed so conflicted. It is, Drew agreed, but it would mean leaving Helena, at least for a while. Catherine felt her heart sink, though she tried not to show her disappointment. When would you need to leave? After Christmas, Drew replied, studying her face carefully. I'd be gone until spring at the earliest, possibly longer. Catherine forced a smile. Well, I'm very happy for you, Drew. You deserve such recognition. Drew frowned slightly, seeming dissatisfied with her response. That's not I mean, I haven't decided whether to accept yet. Why not? Catherine asked, genuinely puzzled. It sounds ideal for you. Drew's eyes, when they met hers, held an intensity that made her breath catch. Because there are considerations in Helena that make leaving difficult. Catherine felt a flutter of hope. What kind of considerations? Instead of answering directly, Drew reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small package wrapped in brown paper. I've been carrying this around for 2 weeks now, trying to find the right moment, he admitted, handing it to her. Maybe there isn't a perfect moment. Curious, Catherine unwrapped the package to reveal a small leather-bound book, a first edition of Elizabeth Barrett Browning's Sonnets from the Portuguese that she had admired in the bookseller's catalog but couldn't afford. Drew, she breathed, carefully opening the exquisite volume. This is too much, read the inscription, he urged gently. Catherine turned to the flyleaf, where Drew's neat handwriting filled the page. To Catherine, who showed me that life offers second chances to those brave enough to take them. With deepest affection, Drew, she looked up, her eyes bright with unshed tears. It's beautiful, Drew, thank you. Drew took a deep breath as if gathering courage. Catherine, I find myself at a crossroads. This job is everything I've worked toward professionally, but the thought of leaving you behind, it's more difficult than I anticipated. Catherine's heart was pounding now. What are you saying, Drew? I'm saying that I care for you, he said simply, honestly. More than I thought possible to care for anyone again after Sarah. And I need to know if you might someday feel the same, because that would change everything for me." The moment hung between them, fragile and pregnant with possibility. Katherine thought of the night on the bridge, how close she had come to never knowing this man, this feeling. "Drew," she said softly, "I already do." The relief and joy that crossed his face made her heart swell. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, Drew leaned forward and kissed her. It was a gentle kiss, tender and questioning, but it held the promise of deeper passion. When they parted, Drew kept his forehead pressed against hers. "I won't take the job," he murmured. "Not if it means leaving you." Katherine shook her head, pulling back slightly to meet his eyes. "No, you should take it if it's what you really want. We can find a solution that doesn't require either of us to sacrifice what's important." Drew looked at her with wonder. "You're an extraordinary woman, Katherine Osborne. Do you know that?" She smiled, feeling truly happy for the first time in longer than she could remember. "I'm just a woman who's learning to believe in life again, thanks to you." As snowflakes continued to fall gently around them, Drew pulled her close for another kiss, this one deeper, more certain. Katherine responded with equal fervor, her heart full with the knowledge that the darkest night of her life had somehow led her to this bright, unexpected dawn. The weeks leading up to Christmas passed in a blur of happiness for Katherine. Her relationship with Drew blossomed, their connection deepening with each day they spent together. Drew formally courted her, calling at the boarding house with flowers, taking her to church socials, and spending long evenings by the fire discussing everything from books to their hopes for the future. Mrs. Sullivan watched their courtship with undisguised approval, often finding excuses to leave them alone in the parlor while commenting loudly about what a fine couple they made. The other boarders teased Katherine good-naturedly about her cowboy beau, but she didn't mind. Their happiness for her was genuine. As Christmas approached, Katherine threw herself into the holiday preparations. She helped decorate the boarding house with evergreen boughs and red ribbons, baked cookies using Mrs. Sullivan's recipes, and even joined the church choir for the Christmas Eve service. Drew, meanwhile, had decided to accept the foreman position at Blackstone Ranch, but with a compromise that satisfied them both. He would start after the new year, but return to Helena at least once a month, and Katherine would visit the ranch when weather permitted. "It's only temporary," he assured her as they walked arm in arm through the festively decorated town square one evening. "I've been saving for years to buy my own spread. Another year or two, and I'll have enough for a decent start." "I'm proud of you," Katherine said sincerely. "And a few months of separation won't matter in the long run." Drew squeezed her hand. "Speaking of the long run," he said, his tone carefully casual, "I was hoping you might join me for Christmas Eve dinner at my cabin tomorrow. I'd like to show you some improvements I've been making." Katherine raised an eyebrow, intrigued by his slightly nervous manner. "I'd love to. Should I bring anything?" "Just yourself," Drew replied with a smile that didn't quite hide his anticipation. Christmas Eve dawned clear and cold, with fresh snow sparkling in the winter sunlight. Drew arrived promptly at 4 o'clock to collect Katherine, who had spent the afternoon helping Mrs. Sullivan prepare the boarding house's Christmas dinner, before changing into her best dress, a deep green wool that complemented her auburn hair. "You look beautiful," Drew said sincerely as he helped her into the sleigh. "Green suits you." The ride to Drew's cabin was magical, with the landscape transformed by snow and the late afternoon sun casting everything in golden light. As they approached the cabin, Katherine noticed several changes: new curtains in the windows, a freshly painted door, and smoke curling invitingly from the chimney. "You have been making improvements," she observed as Drew helped her down from the sleigh. "Wait until you see inside," he replied with barely contained excitement. Katherine gasped when Drew opened the door. The simple cabin had been transformed. A small Christmas tree stood in one corner, adorned with paper stars and candles. The table was set with what appeared to be Drew's best dishes and a red tablecloth that Katherine recognized as new. A delicious aroma wafted from the stove, where a pot bubbled gently. "Drew," she breathed, taking it all in. "This is wonderful, Mrs. Sullivan helped with the stew," he admitted sheepishly. But I made the bread myself, and the pie, well, we'll call that an experiment, Katherine laughed, deeply touched by his efforts. It's perfect. They enjoyed a simple but delicious meal, with Drew proudly serving his admittedly misshapen but tasty apple pie for dessert. After they'd eaten, he seemed to grow nervous again, fidgeting with his coffee cup. I have something to show you, he said finally, rising and extending his hand. Outside. Curious, Katherine allowed him to help her into her coat and followed him out onto the small porch. The night was clear, with thousands of stars visible in the velvet darkness and the full moon illuminating the snow-covered landscape. Look there, Drew said, pointing to a spot just beyond the cabin where the moonlight revealed a new structure, the foundation and frame of what appeared to be an addition to the cabin. What is it? Katherine asked, though she had an inkling. It's going to be a proper bedroom, Drew explained. And beyond that, eventually, a kitchen. I'm expanding the cabin, making it more suitable for a family. Katherine's heart quickened as Drew turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. I know it's not much compared to what you grew up with in Boston, he said earnestly, but it's a start. And with time, we could build something wonderful here. Drew, Katherine whispered, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. Reaching into his pocket, Drew withdrew a small velvet box. I was going to wait until spring, he admitted, but I find I don't want to begin this new job, this new chapter, without knowing. He took a deep breath and dropped to one knee in the snow. Katherine Osborne, would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife? He opened the box to reveal a simple but beautiful gold ring set with a small pearl surrounded by tiny diamonds. It was my grandmother's, he explained. My mother left it to me, saying I should give it to the woman who captured my heart completely. Tears of joy filled Katherine's eyes as she looked down at this man who had literally saved her life, and then, more gradually, saved her soul. Yes, she said, her voice trembling with emotion. Yes, Drew Falconer, I will marry you. Drew's face transformed with joy as he slipped the ring onto her finger, then rose to gather her in his arms. Their kiss was deep and passionate, filled with promises for the future they would build together. When they finally parted, Drew rested his forehead against hers. I love you, Katherine. I think I've loved you since that night on the bridge when I saw your courage even in your darkest moment. And I love you, Katherine replied softly, for showing me that life was still worth living, even when I couldn't see it myself. They married in April, when the mountains were still capped with snow but the valleys bloomed with wildflowers. The ceremony was held in Helena's small church, filled to capacity with townspeople who had come to respect and admire Katherine and had long held Drew in high regard. Katherine wore a simple white dress, adorned with lace that Mrs. Sullivan and the other boarders had worked on secretly as a wedding gift. Drew, looking handsome but slightly uncomfortable in a new suit, couldn't take his eyes off his bride as she walked down the aisle toward him. Their vows were heartfelt and personal, each promising to cherish the second chance at happiness they'd found together. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared brought tears to more than a few eyes in the congregation. The reception was held in the community hall, transformed with spring flowers and twinkling lanterns. There was music and dancing, laughter and heartfelt toasts to the new couple. As twilight fell, Drew and Katherine slipped away, boarding the train that would take them to Seattle for a week-long honeymoon. Drew's wedding gift to his bride. I remembered you mentioning your father almost sent you there, he explained as they settled into their compartment. Thought you might like to see it. Katherine's heart swelled with love for this thoughtful man who had become her husband. It's perfect, she said, leaning over to kiss him softly. You're perfect, Drew chuckled, pulling her closer. Far from it, Mrs. Falconer. But I promise to try to be worthy of you every day of our lives together. As the train pulled away from Helena, Katherine looked out at the mountains silhouetted against the evening sky. She thought of that night on Dawson Bridge, how close she had come to an ending that would have robbed her of all the joy she now possessed. What are you thinking about? Drew asked, noticing her contemplative expression. Katherine turned to him with a smile, squeezing his hand. I was thinking that sometimes, what feels like the end of everything is actually just the beginning of something wonderful. Drew brought her hand to his lips, kissing the wedding band that now accompanied her engagement ring. "To beginnings, then," he murmured. "And to all the chapters we'll write together." "To beginnings," Katherine agreed, leaning her head on his shoulder as the train carried them forward into their future, a future bright with promise and love. 2 years later, Katherine stood on the porch of their expanded cabin, now a proper ranch house with a wide veranda that offered spectacular views of their land. Drew had fulfilled his dream of purchasing his own spread, using his savings and experience to establish a modest but profitable horse breeding operation. Katherine cradled their 6-month-old son, James David Falconer, named for both their fathers, as she watched Drew working with a spirited young colt in the corral. The sight of her husband, strong, patient, completely in his element, filled her heart with contentment. The library in Helena had been sorry to lose her when they moved to the ranch permanently, but Katherine had found new purpose in keeping the ranch books, writing articles for the territorial newspaper, and establishing a small lending library for neighboring ranches and the nearby Blackfoot Reservation, where she taught reading lessons twice a week. Life wasn't always easy. Montana's harsh winters and occasional droughts presented challenges, and running a ranch demanded constant hard work from both of them. But they faced each difficulty together, their bond strengthening with each obstacle overcome. As if sensing her gaze, Drew looked up from his work and waved. Katherine waved back, jostling little James, who gurgled happily in response. Drew said something to his ranch hand and then strode toward the house, his face lighting up as it always did when he saw his family. "How are my favorite people?" he asked, climbing the porch steps and dropping a kiss on James's downy head before giving Katherine a more lingering one. "Watching you show that colt who's boss," Katherine replied with a smile. "He seems to be coming along." "He'll make a fine cutting horse with the right training," Drew agreed, taking James into his arms. The baby immediately grabbed for his father's mustache, making Drew laugh. "Strong grip, just like his mother." Katherine raised an eyebrow. "His mother." "Hum," Drew said with a teasing glint in his eye. "Grabbed onto my heart and never let go." "That was terribly sentimental, Mr. Falconer," Katherine said, fighting a smile. "You've made me a sentimental man, Mrs. Falconer," Drew replied unapologetically. "Speaking of which, do you know what today is?" Katherine pretended to consider the question. "Tuesday," Drew shook his head, bouncing James gently in his arms. 3 years ago today, I was riding back to Helena after a cattle drive, and I happened to cross Dawson Bridge at exactly the right moment." Katherine's expression softened. "How could I forget? You saved my life." Drew's gaze was tender as he looked at her. "And you saved mine, Katherine. I was just going through the motions before you came along. You gave me a reason to truly live again." "As did you," Katherine replied softly. "I never imagined, standing on that bridge, that such happiness was possible." Drew shifted James to one arm so he could pull his wife close with the other. "I thank God every day that I was there, that you listened, that we found each other." As they stood together on the porch of the home they had built, their son between them and the land they loved spread out before them, Katherine thought again of that desperate night 3 years ago. The grief that had driven her to the bridge hadn't disappeared entirely. She still missed her father, still thought of her mother and brother with sadness, but it had been transformed, integrated into the tapestry of a life rich with new joys and possibilities. Drew had shown her that life was worth living, and every day since had proven him right. From the darkest moment of her existence had come the greatest blessing of family, a purpose, and a love deeper and more enduring than she had ever dreamed possible. "I love you," she whispered, resting her head against Drew's shoulder as the Montana sunset painted the sky in brilliant hues of gold and crimson. "Today, tomorrow, always." "And I love you," Drew replied, his voice rough with emotion. "Always have, always will." As twilight descended, and the first stars appeared in the vast Montana sky, the Falconer family remained on their porch, content in each other's company, living proof that even in the depths of despair, hope could be found, and that sometimes the end of one story was merely the beginning of a far more beautiful one.